The paper hit the table like a gunshot. Louisa Kendrick stared at it, her hands trembling so hard she had to press them flat against the worn oak surface to keep from shaking apart entirely. The numbers swam before her eyes, but she forced them into focus, forced herself to read every last damning word of the bank notice from Hartwell Savings and Loan of Caldwell, Kansas, dated October 14th, 1882. 3 winters. That was what she had thought she had. 3 winters left on the mortgage her father had taken out 12 years ago. 3 winters to bring the Kendrick cattle operation back from the edge of ruin. 3 winters to prove that a woman alone could hold 40 acres of Kansas grassland and a modest herd together through sheer stubbornness and will. But the paper said 1 winter now. 1. Because someone had purchased the secondary lien on the property. Someone had paid off the balloon note her father had signed in a moment of desperation back in 1875, and in doing so, that person now held the accelerated debt. The entire remaining balance, $432.16, was due by the 1st of April, 1883. 6 months away. 6 months. Her throat closed around a sound she refused to let out, something halfway between a sob and a scream. She had scraped and saved and sold cattle at below-market prices just to keep the regular payments current, had eaten dried beans and salt pork for 3 months straight last winter to avoid drawing on her household reserve, had mended fences at 2 in the morning by lantern light because she could not afford to pay a hand to do it. And now someone had pulled the rug clean out from under her. She snatched the paper up and read the name of the lien holder again. Not the bank, not some faceless financial institution in Wichita or Topeka. A name, a man's name. Martin Norris. She did not know a Martin Norris. She had never in her life heard that name spoken in the county of Sumner, Kansas. Yet there it sat in black ink, bold and unapologetic, the signature of the man who had effectively turned her 3 remaining winters into 1. She was going to find him, and when she did, God help them both, because she had no idea yet whether she was going to beg him for mercy or tear that signed document straight in half. To understand how Louisa Kendrick arrived at that table, paper in hand, heart-shattering, you have to go back 9 months to the February of 1882, to the kind of cold that seeps under doors and into bones, and makes a person question every choice that led them to a cattle spread on the southern Kansas plains. The winter of 1882 had come down hard and early. By mid-February, the creek that cut along the eastern boundary of the Kendrick property had frozen solid from bank to bank, and Louisa had lost 4 head of cattle to a blizzard that swept down out of Colorado on a Thursday night with no warning, and departed on Saturday having claimed everything it could reach. She was 27 years old, had been running this property alone for 2 years since her father Thomas Kendrick had died of a weak heart on a warm August afternoon, and she was deeply, stubbornly, ferociously committed to not losing this land. Her father had come to Kansas in 1869 as part of the great post-war migration that filled the plains with hopeful settlers. He had staked 40 acres of good grassland near the town of Wellington, Kansas, had built a house with his own hands, and had run a modest but respectable cattle operation for more than a decade. He had taken out a mortgage through Hartwell Savings to buy the additional 20 acres that made his grazing range viable. He had paid faithfully for years. Then the hard winter of 1879 had taken most of his herd, and the collapse of cattle prices in 1880 had done the rest. He had refinanced, signed the balloon note, and bought himself time. He had died before the bill came due, and he had left the land and the debt, and the cattle and the question of what to do next entirely to Louisa. She had one older brother, Raymond, who had gone to Colorado to mine silver and had not been heard from in 4 years. She had no husband. She had a neighbor named Vera Hutchins who brought her pies sometimes and told her she was too proud for her own good, and she had a hired hand named Cobb who was 60 years old and half-deaf and worked for room and board because he had nowhere else to go. That was her army. That was what she had. By March of 1882, the freeze had broken and Louisa had ridden into Wellington to make her quarterly payment at Hartwell Savings. The teller was a thin man named Pierce who always looked at her with something between pity and suspicion, as if a woman managing a mortgage was either an object of charity or a source of potential fraud. She had made the payment, taken her receipt, and was walking out when she nearly collided with a man coming through the door. He was tall, not dramatically so, just a few inches above average, but he carried himself with an ease that made him seem larger. He had dark hair that wanted cutting, a jaw shadowed with 3 days of beard, and eyes the color of creek water in late afternoon, a gray-green that shifted depending on the light. He was wearing a good coat, not expensive but well-made, and he carried a leather satchel that looked like it held serious business. He caught her by both arms to keep her from stumbling and released her the instant she had her footing, stepped back, and removed his hat. "Pardon me," he said. His voice was measured, unhurried. "My fault," she said, which was the truth, and walked past him. She did not think about him again for 6 weeks. The second encounter happened in May at the Wellington General Store, when Louisa was buying seed corn and fence wire and a new leather pair of work gloves. He was at the counter when she came in, deep in conversation with the proprietor, a Mr. Aldous Fitch. They appeared to be discussing property lines and survey records, which was the sort of conversation that happened constantly in Kansas as the railroad land grants continued to sort themselves out. She moved around them to get to the dry goods section. She was reaching for a bolt of muslin when she heard him say her name, not to her, to Fitch. "The Kendrick property on the South Quarter Road," he was saying, quietly but not quietly enough. "You know it," Fitch scratched his chin. "Sure. Thomas Kendrick's place. His daughter runs it now. Stubborn girl, good cattle when she has them." A pause. "Is it running in the black?" Fitch lowered his voice, but Louisa, who had very good hearing and had gone very still, caught most of it. "Barely. She's behind on improvements. Herd's small, but she makes her payments, I'll give her that." Louisa set the muslin down, turned around, and walked directly toward the 2 men. "I don't know you," she said to the tall man with the gray-green eyes, "but I know you're asking about my property and my finances, and I would like to know why." He did not flinch. He looked at her with a directness that was almost startling, and then he offered his hand. "Martin Norris," he said. "I'm a land investor, Miss Kendrick. I recently purchased several secondary liens in this county through a Wichita firm. Yours was one of them." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. "You bought my note," she said. "I purchased a secondary lien. You still hold the primary mortgage with Hartwell Savings." He said it with the careful precision of a man who understood the difference and wanted her to understand it too. "I have no immediate plans to accelerate it." "No immediate plans," she repeated. That's an interesting way to offer reassurance. Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "I wasn't offering reassurance. I was offering accuracy." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with that same directness, unhurried, unbothered by her scrutiny. "What are you planning to do with it?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "I'm still assessing." She picked up her gloves, turned back to the counter, completed her purchase, and left without another word. But she thought about Martin Norris all the way home. He had a name. He had a face. He had her secondary note. And he had said nothing yet, and still assessing like a man who had all the time in the world, which meant he was not desperate, which meant he was dangerous in the particular way that patient men are dangerous. She did not sleep well that night. Over the following weeks, she began to hear his name with increasing frequency. Wellington was a town of about 4,000 people in 1882, the county seat of Sumner County, and it had grown fast since the railroad came through. There was money moving through the region, cattle money and railroad money and land speculation money, and Martin Norris, it emerged, was a careful participant in all of it. He had come from St. Louis originally, the story went. Had trained as a surveyor, had worked for a land company in Missouri and then in Kansas, and had broken off on his own 3 years ago to work as an independent land investor. He bought distressed notes and liens, sometimes foreclosed, sometimes refinanced at better terms, sometimes sold on to larger interests. He had a reputation for being precise and fair, which in the land business of 1882 Kansas was either meaningless or everything depending on who you asked. He had an office above the hardware store on Main Street. He had a rented room at the Wellington Inn. He had, as far as anyone knew, no wife, no family in the region, and no obvious vices beyond an occasional cigar in the evening on the inn's front porch. Louisa filed all of this information away like a woman preparing for a siege. She ran the numbers again in June. She looked at what the herd could produce if the summer grass held and the prices firmed, and she drew up a careful plan for the next 3 years that showed she could pay down the secondary lien completely before it ever became a problem. She wrote it out in her careful hand in the ledger her father had kept, and she felt briefly the solid ground of a viable plan under her feet. Then July came, and with July came the drought. It started as a dry stretch that everyone assumed would break in a week. It did not break. By the end of July, the grass that her cattle depended on was dry and brown, and the creek was running at half its normal depth. She had to move the herd twice, which cost her time and the hired help of 2 extra men for 3 days. By the end of August, the drought was a crisis, and by mid-September 3 of her remaining 22 head were showing the hollow flanks of animals that were not getting enough to eat. She was forced to sell 6 head early, at the fall market in Wellington, at prices that were 30% below what she had budgeted for. She stood in the livestock pen and watched them lead her cattle away, and felt the first real brush of cold fear she had allowed herself since taking over the property. She could still make the winter payment, but the spring payment was going to be a problem. It was in late September, at the Wellington Town Social held in the Methodist Church Hall, that she encountered Martin Norris for the 3rd time. These socials happened on the last Saturday of each month, and were one of the few genuine community institutions in the county. Everyone came, because everyone needed the thread of human connection that a hard rural life could stretch dangerously thin. Louisa came because Vera Hutchins insisted, and because she was not willing to let her neighbors see her retreat. She wore her good dress, a dark blue wool she had made herself 2 winters ago, and she put her hair up and she walked into that church hall with her chin level. Martin Norris was standing near the refreshment table talking to Judge Henderson, and a man she recognized as a rancher from the North County, a Mr. Boland. He was wearing a white shirt and a dark vest, and he had shaved, which made him look younger and also made those gray-green eyes more immediately visible. He glanced over as she came in, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he had noted her arrival before she had noted his presence. She deliberately went in the opposite direction. The Wellington Church Hall was not large, and the social lasted 3 hours, and eventually their orbits intersected at the edge of the floor where a fiddle player and a small band were providing music for dancing. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "Mr. Norris." A beat of silence between them that had too much inside it. "I heard about the drought losses," he said, which was either considerate or calculated. "As did half the county," she said. "It was not a private catastrophe." "No," he said, "it wasn't." He looked at her. "Are you managing?" The question was direct and genuine in a way she had not expected. She had been bracing for something tactical. The simple sincerity of it knocked her slightly off balance. "I'm managing," she said. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause that felt careful, "Would you like to dance?" She should have said no. She understood clearly that saying yes was a complicated act, that dancing with the man who held her secondary note in front of all of Wellington carried implications she was not ready to sort through. She said yes. He danced well, which surprised her. Not with any particular flair, but with quiet competence, keeping the lead light and sure, not crowding her. They danced a polka and then a slower waltz, and during the waltz he was close enough that she could smell the slight cedar of whatever soap he used, and she was annoyed with herself for noticing. "You resent me," he said during the waltz pleasantly, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I don't resent you," she said. "I don't trust you. Those are different things." "That's fair," he said. Why don't you trust me? Because you're a land investor who holds my secondary note, and you are being kind to me at a town social. And kind behavior from someone in that position is either genuine or tactical, and I don't know which yet. He was quiet for a moment, guiding them smoothly around the edge of the floor. What would it take to demonstrate that it's genuine? Time, she said, and consistent behavior, not just pleasant conversation at dances. He nodded once, as if she had said something reasonable that he intended to act on. The song ended. He stepped back and released her hand with the same careful deliberateness with which he had held it. "Thank you for the dance," he said, and walked away. She stood at the edge of the floor and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was the absence of his presence as a specific and notable thing. Vera Hutchins materialized at her elbow. She was a compact woman in her 50s with bright eyes and an undisguised interest in other people's business. "That was the landman," Vera said. "I know who he is," Louisa said. "He dances nicely." "Vera, I'm just making an observation." Vera looked at her sidelong. "He also hasn't taken his eyes off you since the dance ended." Louisa looked at the punch bowl and refused to check. The fall came fully in October. The drought broke in the second week, which was both a relief and an ache, because the rains came after she had already sold the cattle she had needed to sell. The grass recovered, the creek rose, and the Kendrick property looked, briefly, almost healthy. On the 14th of October, Louisa went to Wellington to do her monthly accounting at the bank. On the way home, she stopped at the post office and there was a letter. It was from the office of Martin Norris, Land and Property, Wellington, Kansas. She opened it standing on the board sidewalk outside the post office with her horse tied to the rail and the October wind moving through her hair. The letter was brief. In formal language, it informed her that the secondary lien had been formally transferred to Martin Norris as of September 1st, 1882. It outlined the remaining balance. And then, in a separate paragraph, it outlined the acceleration clause that had been part of the original balloon note her father had signed, and informed her that due to the restructuring of the note upon transfer, the full remaining balance was now due April 1st, 1883. 6 months. She read it twice. Then she folded it with hands that had gone oddly numb and put it in her coat pocket and rode home, and that was when she arrived at that table, paper landing like a gunshot, life narrowing from 3 winters to 1. She did not go to his office that day. She was too angry, and she knew herself well enough to know that she could not walk into a negotiation while anger was driving the horse. She spent that evening going over every number in her ledger, looking at the situation from every angle, trying to find a path she had not yet seen. There was no path, not without significant help. She went to his office the next morning. It was a Tuesday, the 15th of October, 1882. The office above the hardware store was modest, 2 rooms with a front office that had a desk and shelving of survey maps and ledger books, and a back room she could not see. He was at the desk when she came up the stairs and through the open door, and he stood immediately when he saw her. She put the letter on his desk. "Explain this to me," she said. He looked at the letter and then at her, and she had the clear impression he had been expecting her. "Sit down, Miss Kendrick," he said. "I would rather stand." "All right." He remained standing too, which was at least respectful. He picked up the letter, looked at it briefly, set it down. "The acceleration clause was in the original note your father signed with Wichita First Commercial in 1875. When Hartwell Savings purchased the note, the clause remained. When I purchased the secondary lien, it remained. The transfer triggered the clause." "The transfer that you executed," she said. "Yes. So you accelerated my debt by buying the note." He was quiet for a moment. "Technically, the clause accelerated it upon transfer. I initiated the transfer." "Which means you effectively turned 3 years into 6 months. He did not argue with that. He said, "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He sat down then, slowly, leaning back in the chair. He was not defensive, which was infuriating. He looked thoughtful. "I bought the note because I saw a property that was being held back from its real potential," he said. 40 acres of good Kansas grassland being barely operated by an under-resourced single holder. My initial plan was to offer a renegotiation, better terms, over a shorter period, in exchange for a partial equity stake. She felt the blood rise in her face. You plan to take part of my land. I plan to offer a transaction, he said carefully, one that would have given you capital to improve the operation and given me a stake in a property I believed in. I was going to approach you through proper channels. Then why the acceleration? Why the 6-month notice? He met her eyes. Because the drought changed the calculation. The property lost value this summer. I had to protect my investment, and my legal counsel advised the acceleration. It was the most infuriating thing she had ever heard, not because it was dishonest, but because it was perfectly, clinically reasonable from a business standpoint. He had done nothing illegal. He had done nothing that every other land investor in Kansas was not doing. He had made a decision based on numbers and legal instruments, and she was collateral in that decision. She picked up the letter. I'm going to pay it, she said, every cent by April 1st. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. Miss Kendrick, that's $432. I'm aware. The market price for your current herd, even at spring rates, won't come close. I'm aware of that too. Then how that, she said, is my problem, not yours. She turned to leave. Wait. She stopped but did not turn. I was wrong, he said behind her quietly. She turned then slowly. He was leaning forward now, elbows on the desk, looking at the letter on the blotter between his hands. Not legally, but I should have come to you directly. I should have made the offer about renegotiation before the legal notice. I handled it like a transaction when it was someone's home. That was wrong. She stared at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. It doesn't change the numbers, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She left. She spent the next 2 weeks in a state of focused, determined, quietly desperate activity. She wrote to the cattle broker in Wichita who had bought from her father, asking for advance market prices and whether he could guarantee a purchase at spring rates if she could get the herd to a certain size. She wrote to the First National Bank of Wellington asking about a consolidation loan and received in return a letter politely explaining that they did not typically lend to unmarried women operating independent property. She wrote to her brother Raymond at the last address she had for him in Colorado and received no reply. She sold her mother's silver tea service, which she had held onto through every other financial difficulty, because her mother had carried it from Ohio in 1869, and it was the last material thing her mother had left. She got $42 for it from a collector in Wichita. She held the money in her hands and felt like she had sold something of herself. She was short. Even with every liquid asset she could convert, she was going to be short by somewhere between $150 and $200 come April. In November, Martin Norris appeared at her gate. She was in the yard, mending a piece of harness, when she heard a horse on the road. She looked up, and there he was, sitting his horse at the gate with his hat in his hand, looking at her with that same direct, quiet attention. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "You can speak from there." He considered that for a moment, then dismounted, tied his horse to the gate post, and remained on the road side of the fence. "I've been thinking about the situation," he said. "I'd like to propose something different from what I originally had in mind." "No equity stake," she said immediately. "No equity stake," he agreed. "Something else." He looked at her. The November light was pale and thin, and the fields behind her were going brown and spare, and he was looking at her with a kind of earnest directness that made her want to step back even though she did not. "I'd like to help you pay it off." The silence that followed was total. "Explain that sentence," she said. "I'd like to offer you a working arrangement. I have survey work contracted for the early spring boundary assessments for 3 properties on the North County. I need someone who knows this land, knows the county roads, can help navigate terrain and verify historical boundary markers. It's 6 weeks of work, and I'd pay a fair wage." He paused. "Not charity, work." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the dry grass of the yard between them. "What's the wage?" she said. He named a number. It was a fair number. With it, combined with everything she had already set aside, she could make the April payment. "Why?" she said. He looked at the gate post. Then he looked back at her. "Because I made a mistake that cost you significantly, and because I am trying to be a man who corrects his mistakes." She wanted to find the hidden motive in it. She looked for it the way she always looked for the trap in a situation that appeared too simple. But his face held nothing she could use as evidence of deception. He just looked like a man who had done a wrong thing and was trying to do right. "I'll need the arrangement in writing," she said. "Of course," he said. "And if I find other solutions before the work begins, I reserve the right to decline the work and find other means." "Absolutely," he said. She nodded once. "Come back tomorrow with the written proposal." He came back the next day. The proposal was clean, clearly written, specific about terms and timing. She read it twice, made one amendment regarding the timing of payment, and signed it. That should have been a business transaction. Clean and simple, each party getting something they needed. But then November became December, and the survey work didn't start until March. And in between there were 5 months during which Martin Norris, for reasons she could not entirely explain, kept finding occasions to be in her vicinity. He brought her a copy of a new survey map of the county because he thought she should have one. He stopped by in December because his horse had thrown a shoe on the South County Road and her property was closest, and Cobb fixed the shoe, and then Martin stayed for supper because it was starting to snow. He helped her carry firewood for 20 minutes while waiting for the shoe to be set, working without being asked, without making a performance of it. Supper that night was salt pork and baked potatoes and the last of a jar of preserves Vera had brought over in the fall. They sat at the table with the snow coming down outside and Cobb eating in companionable silence at the far end, and something in the room that felt like warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. "You're from St. Louis," she said. "Originally," he said. "Grew up there. My father was a surveyor. I followed him into it, then went further." "Do you have family there still?" "A sister," he said. "Eleanor. She's married to a doctor. They have 3 children." He said it with a kind of fond distance, the particular tone of someone who loves their family and is simply too far away. "And you chose Kansas." "I chose the work," he said. "Kansas happened to have a lot of it." He looked at the window where the snow was piling on the sill. "I don't dislike it. There's something about the plains, the scale of it. The loneliness of it," she said, without meaning to. He looked at her then, and something in the quality of that look made her feel seen in a way that was uncomfortable, and also the opposite of uncomfortable. "Yes," he said. "That too." After supper he helped clear the table, which Cobb pretended not to notice, and then he rode home through the snow, and Louisa stood at the window watching his lantern diminish down the South County Road and felt something she recognized, unwillingly, as longing. She had not longed for anything in 2 years. She had not allowed herself to. Longing was a luxury, like silver tea services and extra firewood and the idea of help. She had cauterized that part of herself because it cost too much to feel it and still function. Martin Norris was, apparently, a complication. Christmas came, spare and quiet as it always was on the plains. Vera brought a goose and they had Christmas dinner at Vera's place, and Martin was not there because he had gone to Wellington for the holiday celebrations, and Louisa was annoyed with herself for noticing his absence. January of 1883 came in with 3 days of blizzard followed by a cold snap that dropped temperatures to 20 below. Louisa lost 2 more cattle, a young steer and an older cow that had been weakening since fall. She documented the losses with the flat, methodical sadness of a woman who could not afford to feel it fully and still function. She updated her ledger. She looked at the April date. She kept moving. Martin came by the 3rd week of January to tell her the survey contracts had been confirmed and the work would begin in mid-March, earlier than planned, and she was grateful in a way she expressed only as a nod and a brief, steady thank you. But then he came in, because it was 22 degrees outside and she had offered coffee, and they sat at the table and the coffee was hot and the stove was going, and he said, "Tell me about your father." Nobody had asked her that in 2 years. Nobody asked her about Thomas Kendrick, because Thomas Kendrick was part of the debt and the obligation and the story of a woman who had not yet succeeded. But Martin asked about him the way you ask about someone you're genuinely curious about, and so she told him. She told him about her father's hands, how big and capable they were, how he had built this house with those hands from timber he'd hauled from a mill 30 miles away. She told him about the way her father read, slowly and thoroughly, the same books over and over, always with a finger moving under the difficult words. She told him about the summer of 1876, when the cattle prices had been good, and Thomas had taken her to Wellington for the 4th of July celebration, and bought her a piece of red ribbon for her hair that she had kept in her mother's sewing box and still had. Martin listened with the kind of attention that is its own form of gift. He did not offer comments designed to demonstrate that he was listening. He just listened, his hands around the coffee cup, his eyes on her face, fully present in the way very few people ever were. She stopped talking, suddenly aware that she had said more to this man in one sitting than she had said to anyone in 2 years. "He sounds like a good man," Martin said. "He was," she said. "He was not a great businessman, but he was a good man." "Those aren't always the same thing," Martin said. "No," she said, "they're not." Another silence. But this one had texture, warmth in it, the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have just said something true together. She looked down at her coffee cup. "Thank you," she said, "for asking about him." "You seemed like someone who needed to talk about him," he said simply. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that gray-green steadiness that she had decided somewhere in the past 3 months was not calculating. It was just how he looked at things he cared about. "Mr. Norris," she said. "Martin," he said, quietly, without pressure. She heard herself say it just slightly softer than she had intended. "Martin." He smiled, brief and genuine, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it rearranged his face in a way that was thoroughly inconvenient for her determination to keep him at a professional distance. February arrived. The survey work would begin in 5 weeks. The April deadline was 11 weeks away. Lewis's plan was working. Not comfortably, but functionally. She was going to make it. Martin took to stopping by on Wednesday evenings, which was unplanned and became, somehow, expected. He brought a copy of the Wellington Gazette 1 week, because there was an article about a new herd management method being used by ranchers in the Panhandle. He brought a bag of coffee another week because he had bought too much at the store. He brought nothing the 3rd week, just himself and a question about how the herd was looking, and stayed for 2 hours. Vera Hutchins, who noticed everything, said to Louisa in early February with the serenity of a woman stating an established fact, "He's courting you." "He is managing a business interest," Louisa said. "Louisa," Vera said. "Vera, he brought you coffee." That was surplus. "He looks at you like you are the most interesting landscape he has ever surveyed." Louisa pressed her lips together. "That is an extended metaphor I am choosing not to engage with." Vera laughed, which was warm and generous and also deeply irritating. The thing was, Vera was not wrong. Something was happening. Something had been happening slowly and quietly over the past 4 months, like water working through limestone, finding the cracks in the rock of her self-sufficiency and moving through them without asking permission. She trusted Martin Norris. That was the terrifying thing. She had looked for the hidden motive, the dark calculation, the trap. She had applied the full force of her suspicious intelligence to the question of his character and come up consistently with the same answer. He was a precise, careful, fundamentally decent man who had made a mistake and was trying to correct it, and who found her, for reasons she could not entirely explain, compelling. She was afraid of that. She was afraid of needing someone. She had needed her father and lost him. She had needed her brother and he had disappeared. Need, in her experience, was the beginning of loss, but Martin was not asking her to need him. He was just there, quietly, consistently, without drama or demand. He was there on Wednesday evenings with coffee and survey maps and questions about her father. He was there when a section of her fence collapsed in a February windstorm, and he happened to be on the road and stopped and helped Cobb and her reset the posts for 3 cold, muddy hours. He was there at the February town social, and this time he asked her to dance, and she said yes without any internal argument at all, and they danced 3 times, and by the third dance Vera was watching from across the room with an expression of profound satisfaction. In the 3rd week of February, on a Wednesday evening, they were sitting at her table with the usual coffee and a survey map he had brought to show her the route they would take in March, and she looked at the map and looked at the neat precision of his annotations in the margins, small, careful handwriting that was very like the way he did everything, and she said, without planning to, "I'm glad you stopped that day at the gate." He looked up from the map. "In November," she said. "I'm glad you came." "So am I," he said, not with any flourish, just the truth stated directly. She looked at him, he looked at her. And for the first time since she had found that notice on the table, she felt something ease in her chest. Not the problem was still fully intact, the numbers were still what they were, April was still coming. But something else, something that had been wound tight for 2 years and maybe longer, eased. She did not act on it. Neither did he. They looked at the map and discussed the survey route and finished the coffee, and he rode home in the winter dark. And she washed the cups and damped the stove and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about gray-green eyes and small, careful handwriting. March arrived. The survey work began on the 12th of March, as contracted. It was 3 weeks of the hardest, most interesting, most exhausting, and also most alive-feeling work Louisa had done in years. She rode out with Martin each morning, the 2 of them covering the North County terrain with surveying instruments and notes and discussions about historical boundary markers and disputed fence lines. She knew this land with an intimacy that Martin found genuinely useful, knew which creek bends had shifted since the old surveys, knew which ridge markers had been moved by long-ago disputes between neighboring families. He was meticulous in the field, patient and precise, teaching her the language of the survey as they worked, explaining what he was measuring and why, sharing the logic of the work in a way that made her feel like a colleague rather than hired help. She found she had a natural aptitude for it, the spatial reasoning, the attention to detail, the ability to read terrain. They ate lunch every day in the field, whatever she had packed in her saddlebag, bread and hard cheese and dried apples, sitting on whatever rock or fallen log was available, and they talked. About the land, about the history of the county, about St. Louis and Ohio, where her mother had grown up, about books they had each read, about the changes coming to Kansas with the railroad and the new settlers. One afternoon in the 3rd week, they were working along a disputed fence line on the Bolin property, and a cold rain came up suddenly from the west, and they sheltered under a limestone overhang on the edge of a creek bank. It was close quarters, their horses tied back in a stand of cottonwood, and the rain drummed on the limestone above them and turned the creek muddy and fast. Martin was updating his survey notes, hat off, head bent, and a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead in the wet, and he pushed it back with one hand, the gesture entirely unconscious, and something about it was so specifically human and familiar that Louisa felt a sharp, sudden tenderness for him that surprised her completely. "Martin," she said. He looked up. She did not know what she had intended to say. She had not intended anything, had just spoken his name because the tenderness had come out of her as sound. He looked at her for a moment in the gray rain light, sheltered and close, the creek running loud below them. "Louisa," he said. Nobody called her Louisa in that tone of voice. Father had sometimes when he was proud of her, nobody else. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I have spent 4 months looking for the reason not to trust you," she said, "and I cannot find one." She kept her voice even, factual. It was the best she could do. "That frightens me considerably." He put his survey notes down in the satchel. He turned toward her on the narrow ledge of the overhang, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes in the rain light, and he said, "I know." "You know," she said. "I can see it," he said. "Every time you're looking for the trap." She felt the heat come up in her face, because there usually is one. "Yes," he said. "In my experience, there usually is." He paused. "There isn't one here, I want you to know that. I'm not a man with hidden motives where you are concerned, Louisa. I'm a man who made a mistake that hurt you and has been trying to correct it, and in the course of correcting it has found himself, quite thoroughly, in much deeper water than he expected." She stared at him. "You are the most capable person I have ever worked with," he said. "You are the most stubborn, which I also mean as a compliment. You know this land like you grew from it. You are funny without meaning to be, which is the best kind of funny. And you have looked at me like I might be a threat every single time we have spoken, which I understand completely, and which has not stopped me from looking forward to seeing you every single day." The rain was coming harder. The creek was roaring. She was sitting 3 feet from this man in a limestone overhang in a rainstorm, and he had just said all of that in a single, steady, unhurried paragraph. "Martin," she said. "Yes. That is the most words I have heard you say at one time in 5 months." Something happened to his face, a softening, a shift, and then he laughed, a real laugh, full and startled out of him by the observation, and the laugh echoed off the limestone, and she felt it in her chest like the striking of a bell. She laughed too. She had not laughed truly and fully in 2 years. When the laughter settled, they were looking at each other in the diminishing rain, closer than they had been, and his expression had changed into something quiet and open and asking. She leaned forward and kissed him. Or he leaned forward and kissed her. Afterward, neither of them could entirely agree on which had moved first, which seemed eventually like the right way for it to have happened. It was a brief kiss, careful and warm and very certain, the kiss of 2 people who have been moving toward the same point from different directions and arrived at it simultaneously. When they separated, the rain had lightened to a mist. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She pressed her lips together against another smile. "The survey notes need to be finished before we lose the light." "They do," he agreed. They finished the survey. They rode back to her property in the late afternoon mist. At her gate he stopped and looked at her with those eyes, and she looked back. "Wednesday," he said. "Wednesday," she said. He rode away. She rode into the yard. Cobb, who was splitting wood near the barn, took one look at her face and said nothing, which was very wise of him. The survey work concluded on March 28th, 4 days before the April 1st deadline. Martin paid her in full, exactly as contracted, in cash, at the Wellington First National Bank, where she could deposit it immediately. She added it to what she had saved and what she had earned from the early cattle sale, and she counted it out at the teller's window, with Pierce looking on with his customary expression of guarded pity. The total came to $441. $441 against a debt of $432.16. She had $8.84 left over. She paid the debt in full on the morning of April 1st, 1883, standing at the teller's window at Hartwell Savings and Loan, and watched Pierce write "paid in full" across the account ledger in red ink. She folded the receipt. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked out of the bank into the April morning, which was bright and cool with the particular freshness of early spring on the Kansas plains, and she stood on the board sidewalk and breathed. Martin was leaning against the hitching post across the street. He crossed when he saw her come out. She held up the receipt. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said, because she was honest about things. He was quiet for a moment. The April morning moved around them, horses and wagons on the street, the distant ring of the blacksmith, the ordinary business of Wellington, Kansas, going about its morning. "Louisa," he said. "Martin," she said. "I have something to ask you," he said. She looked at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and she had a sudden wild thought that he was going to produce another legal document, another lien, another instrument of financial complication, and she almost laughed. He produced a small ring, a plain gold band set with a single small garnet, unpretentious and real. "I am aware," he said, that this is sudden only in its formal expression and entirely unsudden in every other sense. He paused. I am also aware that you have spent the better part of a year examining me for evidence of bad character, which I respect and which I would like the opportunity to continue disproving for the rest of my life. Another pause. Louisa Kendrick. Will you marry me? She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She looked at the paid-in-full receipt in her hand and then at the April sky above Wellington, Kansas, and then back at him. Yes, she said, with conditions. He blinked. Then that smile appeared, the real one, the one that rearranged his whole face. Of course, with conditions. I keep the property in my name. Obviously, he said, and I keep the ledgers. I would not have it any other way. And you stop sleeping at the inn and move out to the property, because we are going to need the room you save on rent for cattle. He looked at her for a moment, the ring still in his hand between them, and his expression was the fullest and most undone she had ever seen him. Those are excellent conditions, he said. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it, the small garnet catching the April light, warm red against the pale skin of her hand. He leaned in and kissed her on the street, in front of all of Wellington, which caused Vera Hutchins, who had happened to come out of the dry goods store across the street at exactly that moment, to make a sound of such profound satisfaction that people half a block away turned to look. They were married 3 weeks later on a Saturday in late April at the Wellington Methodist Church. Vera Hutchins made the food. Cobb wore his good coat and wept openly, which he did not apologize for. Judge Henderson performed the ceremony. The church was full, because Wellington in 1883 was a town that took any excuse for celebration seriously. Martin stood at the front of the church and watched Louisa walk down the aisle in a cream-colored dress. She had made herself from fabric she had bought in Wellington with the $8.84 left over after paying the debt. And his expression was one of such transparent, unguarded love that several women in the pews were moved to tears independently of any other emotional cause. Louisa walked toward him with her chin level, as always, and when she reached him and looked at his face, she allowed herself, finally, the full weight of it. The love she had been accumulating in careful, defended increments since November, since the gate, since the surveys, since the rainstorm and the limestone overhang and the first laughing kiss. She let herself feel all of it at once. It was enormous. It was frightening. It was also the best thing she had ever felt in her life. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The rains came at the right times, and the grass grew strong, and the herd rebuilt itself with a confidence that felt like reward rather than luck. Martin set up his survey practice from the property, which was well positioned between Wellington and several neighboring counties, and gave him a practical base for the North County work that continued to come in steadily. He was a quiet presence in the house, which Louisa had expected, but he was not an absent one. He was thoroughly present in the ways that counted. He noticed things. When she was tired before she said so, when the ledger numbers were weighing on her from the way she held herself at the table, when she needed to laugh. He brought her things without fanfare, a better kerosene lamp because the old one was hard on her eyes when she read at night, a book of plant illustrations she had mentioned admiring in the window of the Wellington bookshop. He also let her lead when she needed to, and this was the thing she had not been certain any man would do. When it came to decisions about the cattle and the property and the operations she had been running for years, he offered opinions when asked and otherwise supported her judgment, treating her knowledge of the property as the expertise it was. She found herself, that first summer, discovering what it was to be truly partnered, not managed, not protected in the diminishing sense. Partnered. They disagreed about things, about the best use of the South Quarter, which she wanted to keep in grass, and he thought might support a small winter wheat crop that could generate additional income. They argued about this for most of July, both presenting their reasoning with the thoroughness of people who like to be correct, and eventually reached a compromise that involved trying a small winter wheat plot on just the southeast corner of the South Quarter, which Louisa agreed to with the proviso that she retained the right to say "I told you so" if it failed. The wheat plot did not fail. In fact, it did quite well, which Martin did not rub in, and which she acknowledged graciously, and which became the foundation of a larger wheat operation in subsequent years. She never entirely admitted this had been a good idea. He never pressed her to. In the fall of 1883, she learned she was expecting their first child. She told Martin on a September evening after supper. He was reading at the table, which he did most evenings, and she put a cup of tea in front of him and sat down and said, "I believe there is going to be a new addition to the household accounting." He looked up from his book. He looked at her face for a moment. Then he very carefully set the book down and stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her hands in his and said, with a kind of quiet wonder that cracked something open in her chest, "Are you certain?" "As certain as one can be at this stage," she said. He raised her hands to his mouth and pressed them there, eyes closed, for a long moment. When he looked at her, his eyes were bright. "Louisa," he said, in the tone that still undid her, the one that had been hers alone since January. "Don't you cry," she said, because she was the one who was not going to cry, except that she was, and they both knew it. He wrapped his arms around her and she let herself be held, really held, in the way she had not let herself be held since she was a girl, and the September evening settled around the house on the South Quarter Road, and it was perfectly, unreasonably good. Their son was born in May of 1884, a healthy, loud, substantial boy whom they named Thomas Martin Norris. He had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, and Cobb, who was by this point essentially a member of the family in every meaningful sense, declared him the finest child he had ever seen, which Vera Hutchins noted was an observation of limited credibility since Cobb had no known experience of children, but nonetheless stood as offered. The property grew. The herd expanded to 38 head by the end of 1884, managed with the systematic attention that Louisa brought to everything, and the additional capital that Martin's survey income contributed steadily to the household fund. They installed a proper kitchen stove in the fall of 1884 to replace the old wood range, and a real dining table with 6 chairs, because they had started having people for supper on Saturday evenings, and the house that Thomas Kendrick had built with his hands and his hope felt, for the first time in years, like a house that had room in it. Louisa hired 2 young men from Wellington to help with the cattle operation in the spring of 1885. They were brothers named Dale and Francis Cord, 19 and 21 years old, recently arrived from Missouri with strong backs and a willingness to learn that she found encouraging. She ran a tight operation. Her men were paid fairly and on time and were treated as working adults. Martin noted, with quiet approval, that the Cord brothers were visibly more motivated than the typical hired hand, which had everything to do with how they were being managed. In the summer of 1885, Raymond Kendrick returned. He arrived on a June morning on a horse that had seen better years, looking thinner and older than his 33 years, and carrying the particular expression of a man who has been away long enough to be uncertain of his welcome. He tied his horse at the gate and stood there until Louisa came out. She looked at him for a long moment from the porch. He looked back at her with the wary eyes of someone who was not certain he deserved to be there. She came down off the porch and walked across the yard and put her arms around him, and Raymond Kendrick, who had been in Colorado for 5 years and had not written, and had not come home when their father died, or when Louisa faced losing everything, held on to his sister and said her name in a broken voice, and cried in the way men cry when they have been holding it for years. Martin watched from the kitchen window. He went back to what he was doing and gave them time. Raymond stayed 2 weeks. He had been in the Colorado silver mines, had made money, lost money, made it again in a smaller way, and had spent the last year feeling the pull of Kansas like a rope around his chest. He was not asking to come back, he said, just to see the place and know that it was all right. It was all right. It was better than all right. Raymond spent 2 weeks helping with cattle and fences, and eating Lewis's cooking and meeting his brother-in-law for the first time with the slightly cautious regard of a man who is not sure he has earned the right to have opinions about his sister's husband. By the end of the 2 weeks, the caution had given way to something genuine. Martin treated Raymond with the respect of someone who had no scores to settle and was not interested in resentment that was not his. "He's a good man," Raymond said to Louisa on his last evening. "I know," she said. "Better than you," Raymond said, which was the kind of thing only a brother could say and survive. She threw a dish towel at him. Raymond went back to Colorado and came back to visit the following Christmas and the Christmas after that. And eventually, he married a woman from Denver and settled there. And the correspondence between the Norris household in Sumner County, Kansas, and the Kendrick Marsh household in Denver, Colorado, was regular and warm. Baby Thomas grew into a toddler with emphatic opinions about everything, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He developed an early passion for the cattle, following Cobb around the yard with the wobbling determination of a very small person with large ambitions. And Cobb, who had no children and no family of his own, took to it with a grandparent's particular and uncomplicated love. In 1886, Louisa discovered she was expecting again. She told Martin in the same way as the first time, the same careful wording, and he responded with the same wonder and also with the additional context of a man who knew now what was coming, who put both hands on her face and kissed her forehead and said, "Thomas is going to be insufferable about a sibling." He was correct. Thomas was 3 and fully verbal and had opinions about the new arrangement that he expressed frequently and at volume. He was not in favor of sharing, which was a position his mother had some sympathy for, and his father gently countered on a daily basis. A daughter arrived in February of 1887. She was smaller than Thomas had been at birth, quieter, with dark hair right from the start and her father's watchful gray-green eyes. They named her Clara Rose Norris, for no one in particular, just because it sounded right. Thomas regarded her in her cradle with the wariness of a recently dethroned monarch, and then, over the following weeks, with increasing interest, and then with the passionate protective devotion of a small boy who has decided that this small person is, in fact, his, regardless of what anyone else says. Martin watched his son become a brother and felt something that did not have a clean name, a complex and tremendous thing made of love and time, and the particular grace of watching people you love becoming more than they were. He found Louisa in the kitchen one evening that spring, Clara asleep in the crib near the stove, Thomas already in bed, the house quiet with the deep quiet of a home after children. She was entering figures in the ledger, which was the exact thing she had been doing when he first realized he was in love with her, though he had not said that at the time, and she had been doing it at a different table in entirely different circumstances. He sat down across from her. "Up. What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking at you." She made the expression that was her version of being pleased and not wanting to show it, the slight compression of her lips against a smile, the particular cast of her eyes. "The ledger is in excellent shape," she said. "I know," he said. "I checked this morning." She narrowed her eyes. "You checked my ledger?" I was curious, "and it is technically also my financial situation." "I am the ledger keeper," she said. "You are," he agreed. I was purely an admiring observer. He leaned forward on the table. "The wheat plot should yield 30% more than last year." 32, she corrected. He smiled. She caught it and looked down at the ledger, but the smile was already working its way onto her face, private and warm. "Louisa," he said. She looked up. "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him across the table in the spring evening, with the ledger in her hands and Clara sleeping behind her and Thomas dreaming upstairs and the cattle in the field and the wheat growing in the south quarter, and the paid-in-full receipt framed on the kitchen wall, which she had framed herself in a moment of deep satisfaction. "Yes," she said, "I am." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it palm up and held his in return, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet house while the spring Kansas evening settled around them. The spring of 1887 also brought a development that neither of them had anticipated but which both welcomed in different ways. Martin was approached by the new Sumner County Land Office, which had been established in Wellington as the county's growth continued, with a proposal for a formal survey contract covering the entire eastern section of the county. It was the largest survey contract he had ever been offered, 6 months of work, a substantial payment, and an implicit invitation to establish a more permanent official role in the county's land record system. He discussed it with Louisa in the way they discussed everything important, at the table over coffee, each of them taking turns laying out the considerations. The income would significantly accelerate their ability to expand the herd and make planned improvements to the barn and outbuildings. It would, however, take him away from the property for extended periods during the summer months, which would put more of the operational management on her. She pointed out that she had managed the property alone for 2 years before he arrived, which was true, and that she now had 2 hired hands in Cobb, which was considerably better. She pointed out also that the survey contract would establish him more formally in the county, which had value for their long-term stability. She told him to take it. He took it. The summer of 1887 was the busiest of their lives so far. Martin worked the survey contract from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week, riding the eastern county with his instruments and his notes. Louisa ran the cattle operation, managed the wheat harvest in August, negotiated the cattle sale at the fall market with a precision and firmness that extracted $2 more per head than the previous year, raised Thomas and Clara with the help of Vera Hutchins, who had become, by this point, a daily presence in the house and an essential one, and kept the ledger in the excellent shape she always kept it in. When Martin came home in the evenings, which was not every evening during the heavy survey weeks, he found a house that was running with the organized purposefulness of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and did not require rescuing. He found that attractive in a way that never diminished the competence of her, the deep ability of her, the way she had never stopped being the woman who had put her hands flat on the table and looked at impossible numbers and said she was going to pay it. But he also found her tired sometimes, pushed too close to the edge of what one person could carry, even a very capable person. He made a point, those evenings when he was home, of taking Thomas off her hands entirely from the moment he arrived, giving her the hours after supper for whatever she needed, which was sometimes the ledger and sometimes a book, and sometimes simply sitting on the porch in the evening air doing nothing at all. She did not tell him she needed this. She had never asked for it. He just did it, the same way he had helped carry firewood without being asked, the same way he had fixed fence posts in the rain without making a production of it. She thought sometimes, sitting on that porch in the summer evenings with the Kansas plains going gold and the sound of Thomas's laughter from inside and Clara's baby sounds and Martin's low voice talking nonsense with the children, about the woman she had been 3 years ago. The woman who had put that letter on the table and felt the world narrow to a single, terrifying winter. She thought about the hidden motive she had looked for and not found. She thought about the trap she had expected and the limestone overhang and the rain. She thought about the first time he had said her name in that particular way. She thought that she had spent so long preparing for loss that she had almost missed what was being given. The survey contract was completed in October of 1887, and Martin accepted a permanent part-time role with the Sumner County Land Office, which gave him a stable base income while leaving him free to continue private survey work. It was the kind of arrangement that suited him precisely, enough structure, enough independence. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was a good winter, cold but not devastating, with enough snow to water the spring grass and not enough to cause losses. Thomas turned 4 and learned to read under his mother's exacting tutelage and his father's patient assistance, and proved to be exactly as stubborn a student as you would expect from those particular parents, and also exactly as quick. Clara walked at 11 months and immediately set about organizing the household to her specifications, which apparently included all of Thomas's toys being accessible to Clara at all times, a point on which Thomas had his own views. In the spring of 1888, Cobb's health began to fail. It happened slowly at first and then quickly, as these things do. He was 66 years old and had been giving everything to the work of the Kendrick property for years, the work of 2 younger men in a body that had been old for decades. By April, he could not do the heavy work. By June, he could barely manage the lighter tasks, the sorting, the feeding, the simple things. Louisa brought him into the house. She set up his room off the kitchen where it was warm and accessible, and she managed his care with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Martin hired an additional hand to cover what Cobb had been doing, a capable young man named Henry Pratt from Wellington. Cobb spent his last months in the kitchen, watching Thomas and Clara play, occasionally offering opinions on cattle management that were always correct, and being visited by Vera Hutchins, who brought him pies and sat with him in the afternoons when Louisa needed to be working. He died in November of 1888, in his bed, in the house, surrounded by the family he had been part of for 20 years. Louisa buried him on the property, on the east slope where the creek could be heard. Under a cottonwood, he had planted himself as a sapling 10 years earlier. She spoke at the grave in a clear voice that did not break until the last sentence, and when it broke, Martin was beside her with his hand in hers, and she let him hold her weight for that moment. Thomas, who was 4 years old and had understood that Cobb was gone in the particular, total way that small children understand death, said at supper that evening that he thought Cobb was probably teaching the cattle in heaven how to go where they were supposed to. And this made Louisa laugh through tears, and Martin took her face in his hands and kissed her in front of the children, and Thomas made an expression of regal displeasure and Clara clapped. The spring of 1889 brought more rain than they had seen in 5 years, and the grass came in thick and extraordinary, and the herd was now 44 head of good Kansas cattle. The wheat was already promising 35 bushels to the acre. The barn had been expanded the previous summer. The house had 2 additional rooms added to it, and the Norris property on the South Quarter Road was one of the genuinely successful small cattle operations in Sumner County. Louisa turned 34 in June of 1889. Martin was 36. They had been married for 6 years, which felt both very short and like the whole shape of everything. They were in the habit, by this time, of riding the fence lines together in the early morning before the day's work separated them. It was the time they talked, away from the children and the hired hands and the demands of the property, with the morning light coming up gold over the Kansas grassland, and the horses moving at an easy walk along the fence. One morning in September, riding the east line where the cottonwood stood over Cobb's grave, Martin said, "I've been offered another county contract." The western section this time, bigger than the eastern one, she asked, somewhat. 8 months. 8 months is long. It is. He was quiet for a moment. I've also been offered a position in the county office, permanent chief surveyor. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence line ahead, his profile against the morning sky. Which do you want? She said. He was quiet. Martin, she said. He looked at her. I want whatever is right for us, he said, and I cannot always tell which thing that is. She considered it. The permanent position means steady income, predictable schedule, being home every night. Yes. The contract means more money in the short term, months away. Yes. She looked at the cottonwood. She looked at the cattle moving in the middle distance. She looked at him. Take the permanent position, she said. You're certain? You've been traveling this county for years, building other people's understanding of the land, she said. I think it's time you had a stake in the record of it. She paused. And Thomas is 5. He needs his father home. He looked at her. I also need you home, she said plainly, because she had learned over 6 years to say true things when she knew them to be true. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand. They rode the rest of the fence line like that, hand in hand in the September morning, and the Kansas grassland spread around them golden and vast and entirely theirs. Martin took the position as chief surveyor of Sumner County, Kansas, which he began in January of 1890. It proved to be exactly the right fit, using all of his precision and his knowledge of the county, and the permanence of it gave him a standing in Wellington that translated, quietly, into influence on things that mattered. He was known for his fairness in disputes, which were constant in a county still sorting out its land boundaries. He was known for being impossible to bribe, which was rarer than it should have been. In the spring of 1890, Louisa discovered she was expecting a third child. She did not tell Martin in the usual way this time. She waited until the evening after Thomas was in bed, and Clara, who was 3 and had her mother's absolute confidence and her father's quiet watchfulness, was finally asleep, and she sat down at the table and said, "I am going to need to hire additional help for the summer." Martin looked up from his notes. "Why?" She looked at him. She let a beat pass. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and came around and picked her up off the chair, which he had not done since their wedding, and she laughed in genuine surprise and held on. "Martin Norris," she said. "Louisa Norris," he said, which was the name she had eventually, privately, claimed as her own, though the property and the ledgers remained under Kendrick in the county records, a point of principle she maintained and he fully supported. Their second son arrived in November of 1890. They named him James Cobb Norris, and when Louisa told Vera, who was at the house when they were discussing names, what the middle name would be, Vera sat down in the kitchen chair and wept in the loud, uninhibited way she did everything, and then composed herself and said it was a perfect name and began making plans for a celebration. James arrived as loud and robust as Thomas had been, with his mother's dark hair and strong opinions, and his father's patience in reserve for when the opinions had been expressed. Thomas, now 6, regarded the new baby with the expertise of someone who had been through this before and declared him acceptable. Clara, at 3, began supervising his development immediately. The family was complete in the way that feels both wholly sufficient and full of room for more. Wellington grew through the 1890s. The railroad brought more settlers, new businesses, new conflicts between established families and newcomers, new demands on the county survey office. Martin navigated all of it with the same unhurried precision that had characterized everything he did. The Norris property became one of the established operations in the county, the kind of place that newer settlers looked at and understood as evidence of what was possible. Louisa expanded the cattle operation to 60 head in 1892 and added a contract with a Wellington butcher that gave them a reliable local market independent of the volatile fall cattle prices. She also, in 1893, began keeping a more formal set of accounts for 3 other small operations in the county, whose owners asked her help after seeing how well the Norris property ran. She charged a modest fee and was scrupulously professional about it, and it generated income that went directly into a fund she was building for the children's education. She and Martin argued about whether Thomas should be sent to a proper school in Wichita for his secondary education, a conversation that lasted the better part of 2 years and involved Thomas himself, who had opinions, and Clara, who also had opinions, and eventually resulted in Thomas going to Wichita for school at 14 and hating it for 3 weeks, and then coming to love it in the thorough way people love things they were initially too proud to admit they wanted. Vera Hutchins, who had been Louisa's neighbor and supporter and honest friend for 20 years, fell and broke her hip in the autumn of 1894, and after a difficult winter came to live in the Norris house, in the room off the kitchen that had been Cobb's. She did not want to be a burden, which she said approximately once and was told firmly not to say again. She was not a burden. She was family. She sat with the children and told them stories of the old Kansas, the days before the railroad, the early settler years, the hard winters. She told them about their grandfather Thomas Kendrick and what he had built. She told them about their mother, the 2 years Louisa had run the property alone, the impossible math of the mortgage, the paid-in-full notice in its frame on the kitchen wall. Thomas listened with a particular focus that suggested he was filing the information away for future use. Clara listened with her father's quiet watchfulness. James, at 4 and then 5, mostly wanted to know about the cattle. One evening, after Vera had told the story about the mortgage and the acceleration clause and the 6 months and April 1st, Thomas, who was 12, turned to his father, who had been listening from his chair with the survey map he'd been working on resting forgotten in his lap, and said, "You were the one who turned it from 3 winters to 1, weren't you? Before you were married." A silence at the table. Martin looked at Thomas. He looked at Louisa. She was looking at the frame on the kitchen wall with the receipt inside it. "Yes," Martin said. "I was." Thomas thought about this. "That doesn't seem like something a good man does," he said, with the brutal directness of a 12-year-old. "It wasn't," Martin said. "It was a mistake." "So why did you do it?" "Because I was thinking about business and I wasn't thinking about people," Martin said. "And there is always a person on the other end of a business decision. I forgot that. I learned from it." Thomas looked at his father for a moment with those gray-green eyes, his father's eyes in his mother's stubborn face. "And that's why you helped her, because you felt guilty." Louisa turned from the wall. Martin looked at his son steadily. "I helped her first because I felt guilty," he said. "And I kept helping her because I fell in love with her. And the distinction matters, so I want you to understand it." Thomas thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded once, a gesture so precisely his father's that Louisa had to look at the table for a moment. "All right," Thomas said. "That makes sense." Vera Hutchins, who had been watching this exchange with enormous satisfaction, said quietly, "Good," and then asked if there was more coffee. Thomas grew into a young man of considerable ability. He came back from his schooling in Wichita in 1898 at 18, with an education in law and accounting, and an interest in land management that was clearly the product of both his parents. He came back to the property and spent a year learning every inch of it, and then went back to Wichita to read law formally, and came back again at 22 to open a small practice in Wellington, focusing on property law, which was in constant demand. He was 23 when he met a young woman named Adeline Cross, who had come to Wellington from Topeka with her family in 1901. She was 20 years old and had her own opinions, which Thomas found immediately engaging, and she had a sharp eye for character that saw directly through the easy confidence he had developed in Wichita to the genuine person underneath, which he found both alarming and right. Louisa, who met Adeline in the early spring of 1901, said to Martin that evening, "She'll do." Martin, who knew Louisa had been watching Adeline with the appraising eye of a woman examining a potential threat to the family equilibrium, looked up from his notes. "Is that favorable?" "That is very favorable," Louisa said. Thomas and Adeline were married in the summer of 1903. They lived in Wellington, where Thomas had his practice and Adeline taught school, and the Sunday visits to the Norris property became one of the regular rhythms of the family's life. Clara, who was 16 in 1903, watched her brother's courtship and marriage with the analytical attention of a person who is quietly drafting her own requirements for the future. She was the most like her father of the 3 children, precise and watchful and deeper than the surface showed, but she had her mother's iron will underneath the quiet. James, who was 13 in 1903, had decided he wanted the cattle and nothing else, which made him the happiest of the 3 in some respects and the most uncomplicated, and which made Louisa's heart do something she could not entirely articulate, because he was exactly the person this land had needed all along, someone who loved it simply and without agenda. In the autumn of 1903, Martin and Louisa rode the fence lines together as they always did on autumn mornings. The air was cold and clear. The cottonwood over Cobb's grave had gone fully gold, and the herd was 62 head of excellent Kansas cattle, the culmination of 20 years of careful, stubborn, loving work. Louisa was 48 years old. Martin was 50. They had been married for 20 years. She was thinking about the woman who had stood on the Wellington sidewalk with a paid-in-full receipt and $8.84 to her name. She was thinking about how that woman had been so certain, so defended, so prepared for every possible betrayal or hidden trap. She was thinking about how wrong she had been to expect the worst, and how profoundly right she had been to be careful anyway, because the caution had made the trust, when it came, something real and tested and capable of bearing the weight she put on it. 20 years, she said. Martin looked over at her. We've been married 20 years, she said. As of last April. I know, he said. I also know you've been married 40 years in terms of actual work put in. She looked at him. He was the same, essentially. A little more gray at the temples, a little more line around the eyes, but the same, those gray-green eyes finding hers with the same unhurried directness that had undone her defenses in a rainstorm 21 years ago. Thank you, she said. For what? For being exactly what you said you were, she said. It turns out that's the rarest thing. He reached across and took her hand. The Kansas autumn morning spread around them, the cattle moving in the far field, the house below with smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney where James was likely already up and managing something, the property her father had built and she had saved, and they had grown into something neither of them could have managed alone. I had a lot of incentive, he said. You had an excellent eye for detecting nonsense, and I was not going to be the nonsense. She laughed. He laughed with her. They turned the horses back toward the house, still hand in hand, the paid debt long since framed and faded on the kitchen wall, the 3 children grown and growing, Vera now in her late 70s and still drinking coffee and noticing everything from the kitchen, the survey maps filling the shelves of Martin's office, the ledgers stacked in order going back to the year before Thomas Kendrick died. James had coffee on when they came in, which he had apparently started doing on autumn mornings sometime in the past year without announcement. Vera was already at her chair. Martin took his coat off and stood at the stove for a moment with his hands around the warm cup and looked at Louisa coming through the door, hanging up her coat, smoothing her hair, checking the ledger on the table by pure habit, the same motion she made every single morning. He loved her with the absolute, settled, unhesitating love of a man who has known and been known, who has been wrong and corrected it, who has shared a fence line and a table and a rainstorm and the births of 3 children and the deaths of people they loved, who has spent 20 years discovering that the most remarkable person he had ever met was also the person who was simply, inexplicably, his. Louisa looked up from the ledger and caught him looking. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I was just looking at you. She pressed her lips against a smile in the old way, the way she had done on the second date, and the 10th and the 100th, and he expected she would do until the last morning. And the Kansas autumn light came through the window and fell across the kitchen table, and the framed receipt on the wall and the open ledger, and the whole, full, completed life they had built from a mortgage and a mistake, and the stubborn grace of a woman who refused to lose what she loved. The wheat numbers are in, she said. Come and look at this. He came and looked. Vera watched them both and said nothing, which was the loudest possible form of profound approval. Outside, James was already in the field with the cattle, and the day was beginning, and the land that Thomas Kendrick had come to Kansas to build was exactly and entirely what it had always had the possibility of being, held by people who loved it and each other with the ferocious, practical, enduring love of those who know what things cost and choose them anyway.